Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Life sometimes throws such plots that even in a nightmare you wouldn't imagine. My world was perfect. A successful husband, a cozy home, a happy family. But all it took was a single spark to turn it all into chaos. I never thought that one encounter would change my life forever. The betrayal that followed stirred the deepest emotions within me, and I found myself in the middle of a love triangle from which there was no escape. It all started on a sunny day when I met his father. My name is Catherine, and I live in a small but cozy town of Savannah, Georgia. My husband Michael and I didn't have children, but that didn't stop us from enjoying life and each other. Michael is a successful lawyer, and I work as a manager at a local art gallery. Our relationship always seemed strong and filled with love, but as it turned out, more was hidden beneath the surface than I could have imagined. That day, Michael suggested spending the weekend with his parents at their country villa. I knew that his father, George, had recently returned from a long business trip, and Michael wanted to spend more time with him. George was a charismatic and charming man, despite being in his 50s. Tall, silver-haired, with a pronounced masculinity, he always commanded respect and admiration. When we arrived at the villa, George greeted us with open arms. The evening was warm and peaceful. We dined on the terrace, laughed, and reminisced about the past. However, I couldn't help but notice that George occasionally glanced at me a little longer than usual. After dinner, Michael decided it was time to go to bed, and George suggested a walk in the garden, and I gladly agreed. We wandered along narrow paths surrounded by blooming bushes, talking about life, work, and the past. I felt an invisible bond forming between us, something more than just familial ties. I tried not to give it much thought, but the feeling persisted. The next day, we spent time at the lake, boating and swimming. George was in great shape, and I couldn't help but notice how he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. There was something in his eyes that made my heart beat faster. In the evening, when Michael went into town on business, George invited me to the terrace for a glass of wine. We sat in soft chairs, enjoying the warm summer evening. The conversation flowed easily and effortlessly, but at some point, it became more personal. George began to talk about his life, about how hard it was to stay away from family, and how he missed closeness and understanding. I listened to him and couldn't help but sympathize. At some point, he leaned towards me and said, "Catherine, you have no idea how much you mean to me." His words were so sincere that I felt a wave of emotions engulf me. He took my hand, and I didn't pull away. At that moment, it seemed right to me that we both deserved a little warmth and attention. We sat like that for a few moments, and then he slowly leaned in and gently kissed me. His lips were soft and warm, and I felt everything inside me tremble at this touch. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't stop anymore. That kiss was the beginning of something new, something unknown and forbidden. And although I understood that it could destroy everything Michael and I had, I couldn't resist this feeling. The next morning came too quickly. I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, realizing that something had happened last night that changed everything. Michael had already gone for a run, leaving me alone with my thoughts and memories of the kiss with George. Questions and doubts swirled in my mind. How could this have happened? Why did I let it happen? George was sitting on the terrace with a cup of coffee when I walked out to join him. Our eyes met, and I saw the same confusion and guilt in his gaze that I felt myself. We didn't say a word, but the tension between us was palpable. He offered me a cup of coffee, and I sat next to him, trying to act as naturally as possible. "Catherine, I don't know how it happened," he began, taking a sip from his cup. "It was wrong, but at that moment, it felt like we both needed it." I nodded, agreeing with his words. "I can't explain it either, George, but we have to stop this. I can't betray Michael." George lowered his head, and I saw the pain in his eyes. "You're right, it was a mistake. We have to find a way to forget about it. But forgetting was not so simple. The whole day passed in oppressive silence. Michael didn't notice anything unusual, but I felt that a chasm had formed between George and me, which wasn't easy to bridge. In the evening, when Michael left for business in the city, George approached me in the kitchen. "Catherine, we need to talk," he said, and I knew this conversation was inevitable. We went out to the terrace and sat in the same chairs where everything had started the night before. "I can't stop thinking about you," George confessed, looking into my eyes. "I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore what I feel." His words stirred a storm of emotions within me. On one hand, I understood that this could ruin my life, but on the other, I couldn't deny that I felt the same way. "George, I can't ignore it either, but we have to be careful. Michael mustn't find out." He nodded in agreement. "Of course, but we need to find a way to deal with our feelings and decide what to do next." At that moment, Michael unexpectedly returned. He walked onto the terrace and found us, just as George was holding my hand. Michael stopped and looked at us with surprise. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tense. I quickly pulled my hand away and tried to explain. "Michael, we were just talking. George was telling me about his business trip and the difficulties at work." George picked up on my thought. "Yes, Michael. We were discussing how hard it was for me to be away from the family. Catherine was supporting me like a caring daughter-in-law." Michael looked at both of us, and I saw doubt in his eyes. "All right, I believe you. But something doesn't seem right," he said, and his words hung in the air like a threat. Over the next few days, the tension in the house grew. Michael tried to act normal, but I could see that he suspected something. Michael was suddenly called away for work to another city for a few days. He packed his things and left, leaving me and George alone in the house. Those days were both torturous and exciting. We tried to keep our distance from each other, but it was almost impossible. George tried to start conversations to dispel the awkwardness, and one evening, when we found ourselves on the terrace again, he suddenly said, "Catherine, I can't hide it anymore. I love you." His voice was full of sincerity and despair. My heart started beating faster, and I felt warmth spread through my chest. "I love you too, George," I whispered in response, and at that moment, I realized that our romance had crossed a line from which there was no return. Our kiss that evening was passionate and long. I felt his lips exploring mine, his arms wrapping around me with such tenderness and passion that I forgot about everything else in the world. We sat in a corner of the terrace, hidden from prying eyes, and the world around us seemed to stop existing. The next morning, I woke up to the gentle touch of George's lips on mine. I was lying in my bed when he entered my room and kissed me softly, as if checking to see if it was a dream. I opened my eyes and saw him standing next to the bed, his eyes filled with tenderness and passion. Without saying a word, I hugged him and pulled him close, feeling the fire ignite inside me. Our lips met in a long and passionate kiss. George slowly lay down beside me, and I felt his touch, both gentle and confident, making me tremble with pleasure. My heart pounded in my chest, and it seemed the whole world ceased to exist. "Catherine, I can't wait any longer," George whispered, his voice husky with desire. I nodded, unable to speak. Without breaking away from each other, we began to shed our clothes. When we finally lay on the bed, George was already on the edge. We merged in a single burst, and that moment was absolutely perfect. His rhythm matched mine flawlessly. Our bodies moved in sync, and I felt our souls merge into one. The whole world disappeared, leaving only this moment, this passion, this moment of complete and absolute closeness. I felt waves of pleasure wash over me. This moment was magical. I cried out in delight, feeling George hold me tight, his breath mixing with mine. We lay side by side, our bodies still trembling from the aftermath of this incredible love. "Catherine, that was incredible," George whispered, looking into my eyes. I smiled, feeling my heart fill with happiness and tranquility. Yes, it was unforgettable, I replied, and we both knew that this moment had changed us forever. The next few days passed in a haze. We tried not to leave the house to avoid attracting attention and spent our time enjoying each other's company. George was tender and caring, his presence giving me a sense of security and love that I hadn't felt in a long time. Our days were filled with conversations, laughter, and of course, passion. We found each other in each other's arms again and again, and each time was as exciting and beautiful as the first. I felt our feelings growing stronger each day and realized that I could no longer live without George. But reality gradually returned, and I knew that Michael would soon come back. We couldn't hide from the world forever. We had to decide what to do next, and that choice was not an easy one. The next few days felt like a fairy tale. George and I savored every moment spent together. Without haste and fuss, we strolled through the garden, talked about everything under the sun, and laughed as we hadn't in a long time. George was a source of joy and tranquility for me, his presence giving me a sense of security and happiness. We spent our evenings on the terrace, enjoying the warm summer nights. George read me poetry, and we discussed books, movies, and dreams. It felt like everything around us had stopped, and the whole world belonged only to us. In those moments, I forgot all problems and worries, immersing myself in an atmosphere of love and harmony. One evening, we decided to cook dinner together. The kitchen was filled with a light-hearted atmosphere. We joked, laughed, and enjoyed every moment. George was at the stove while I was chopping vegetables when he came up behind me and hugged me. I turned to him, and our lips met in a tender kiss. We were so absorbed in each other that we didn't notice the door open. Suddenly, we heard Michael's voice. He was standing in the doorway, his face a mix of shock, anger, and pain. "What's going on here?" His voice was filled with rage. I pulled away from George, feeling the blood drain from my face. "Michael, it's not what you think." But Michael had already come closer, his face blazing with anger. "You were kissing my father? How could you?" George tried to intervene. "Michael, let's talk calmly. We can explain." But Michael wasn't listening anymore. He lunged at George, and a fight broke out. They grappled in the kitchen, breaking furniture and dishes. I screamed, trying to separate them, but emotions had taken over, and no one was listening to me. Blows flew in all directions, and I saw blood appear on both men's faces. Finally, I managed to get a word in. "Stop it, both of you! This isn't going to solve anything!" Michael stopped and, breathing heavily, looked at me. In his eyes, I saw pain and betrayal. "How could you? I trusted you. I loved you." I didn't know what to say. Words stuck in my throat, and I could only look at him with pleading eyes. George stood beside me, also trying to catch his breath, his face bruised and bloodied. Michael turned to George. "You're my father. How could you do this to me?" George tried to explain. "Michael, I understand how you feel, but it was stronger than us. We didn't plan this." Michael turned away from him, his face showing disgust and anger. "I don't ever want to see you again. Both of you betrayed me." He gathered his things without saying another word. I tried to stop him, begged him to stay and talk, but he was adamant. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I watched him leave. In the silence that followed his departure, I felt the weight of what had happened fall on me. I stood in the kitchen, hugging myself, realizing that our peace was shattered forever. George came up to me and hugged me, trying to comfort me, but I felt that nothing could bring things back to the way they were. George and I didn't know what to do next. We felt guilt and despair, realizing that we had destroyed the life of someone we loved. Over the next few days, we tried to reach out to Michael to explain and ask for forgiveness, but each attempt was met with cold silence. George suggested that we go to Michael's home to talk to him face to face. I agreed, though I feared we would be turned away. We got into the car and drove to his apartment in the city. The road seemed endlessly long, and my thoughts were in disarray. What would we say to him? How would we convince him to at least listen to us? When we arrived, Michael was home. I knocked on the door, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. A few minutes passed with no response. Then the door opened, and there stood Michael. His face was serious and distant. "Michael, please give us a chance to explain," I began, trying not to cry. He looked at us with a cold stare. "What is there to explain, Catherine? You both betrayed me." George stepped forward, trying to find the right words. "Michael, I understand how you feel, but it was stronger than us. We didn't want to hurt you." Michael looked at his father with bitterness and disappointment. "Stronger than you? That's just an excuse. You both knew what you were doing." "Please, Michael," I continued. "We both regret what happened. Give us a chance to make it right." He shook his head, his eyes full of pain and anger. "Make it right? Nothing can make this right. I don't want to have anything to do with either of you anymore." Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I felt the weight of what had happened crash down on me. George tried to speak again, but Michael raised his hand to stop him. "No, Father. For me, you both no longer exist. Leave and don't try to contact me again." Michael slammed the door in our faces. I stood on the doorstep, stunned by his words, unable to move. George hugged me, but his embrace couldn't comfort me. We slowly walked back to the car and drove home in complete silence. In the following days, I tried to live as I had before, but everything felt empty and meaningless. George tried to support me, but I could see he was struggling too. We often sat on the terrace, watching the sunset, talking about how to win Michael back. But each conversation ended with the realization that we didn't know how. One evening, as we sat on the terrace, George took my hand. "Catherine, we need to come to terms with the fact that Michael doesn't want to see us anymore. We have to find a way to move forward." I nodded, feeling tears welling up again. "I know, George, but it's so hard." "I understand," he replied, gently hugging me. "But we have to try. Together." We sat there for a long time, holding each other, and I felt that despite everything that had happened, we had each other. It gave me hope that one day we might find a way to live with this burden on our souls. Several months had passed since the day Michael shut the door on us. Life was gradually returning to normal, though the wound left by his departure still bled. George and I continued to be together, supporting each other through this difficult period. We talked a lot about the future and how to cope with the pain that surrounded us. One day, while I was at work in the gallery, one of my colleagues, Laura, noticed that I was lost in thought and suggested that we spend a weekend in the mountains to take our minds off everything. I thought it was a good idea and agreed. When I told George about it, he decided to join us as well. The trip to the mountains was just what we needed. We rented a small cabin at the edge of the forest and spent our days hiking the trails, enjoying nature, and forgetting our troubles. Laura turned out to be great company, and her cheerful spirit helped George and me relax and unwind. One evening, as we sat by the campfire, Laura asked me, "Catherine, how are you coping with all this? I know it's been tough for you." I sighed, staring at the flames. "It's hard, Laura. I still feel guilty about Michael, and don't know if I can ever forgive myself for what happened." George took my hand. "We have to learn to live with it, Catherine. We made a mistake, but we have to move on." Laura nodded. "You're right. We all make mistakes. The important thing is not to dwell on them, but to learn and become better." Her words felt like a revelation to me. I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could do everything possible to make the future better. Our days in the mountains passed quickly, and I felt my confidence gradually returning. Back in Savannah, George and I decided it was time to start a new chapter in our lives. We moved into a new house, leaving behind the memories of the past. Our new neighbors were friendly and welcoming, and we quickly integrated into the local community. George and I began engaging in charity work, helping the local animal shelter and participating in various events. It helped us take our minds off our own problems and feel useful. We found joy in what we did, and it strengthened our relationship. One evening, as we were having dinner on the terrace of our new home, George said, "Catherine, I'm proud of how we've handled this ordeal. We've become stronger and closer to each other." I smiled, feeling warmth fill my heart. "I'm proud of us too, George, and I believe we can overcome anything life throws at us." Our days became brighter and more fulfilling. We found new meaning in life and continued to move forward despite our past mistakes. Time healed our wounds, and we learned to live with what had happened. However, thoughts of Michael never left me. I often thought about him, hoping he would find it in his heart to forgive us and start a new life. George and I understood that restoring our relationship with him would be difficult, but we never lost hope.